The silent hero of Millfield. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in Millfield, the kind of morning when the air felt lighter, and the faint golden hues of sunlight painted the quiet streets of the small town. Millfield was the sort of place where life moved at its own pace, a town untouched by the chaos of the world beyond its borders. Its narrow roads wound between modest houses, each with its well-kept yard, and the town square served as a gathering place for those who called this place home. Everyone knew everyone, or at least they thought they did. At the edge of town stood Benny's Diner, a fixture in Millfield for nearly 40 years. Its neon sign flickered slightly in the early light, casting a warm glow over the parking lot. Inside, the diner hummed with quiet life. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of sizzling bacon, wrapping around the patrons like a familiar embrace. Booths and tables were occupied by the regulars, and the waitress, Alice, moved with practiced ease, refilling mugs and exchanging warm greetings. In a corner booth by the window sat Leonard Harris, a man who had been a silent part of the town's fabric for decades. At 75, Leonard's weathered face bore the lines of a life lived with both purpose and hardship. His short-cropped silver hair contrasted with his deep, thoughtful eyes that seemed to have seen far more than the sleepy town could ever imagine. He wore a neatly pressed button-down shirt, the cuffs slightly frayed but clean. He sipped his coffee in measured intervals, flipping through the pages of the local newspaper with hands that trembled faintly, a telltale sign of age or something deeper. Leonard had made Benny's Diner part of his morning ritual. He liked the routine, the predictable hum of life around him, the sunlight streaming through the window, and the hot coffee that Alice always served him without needing to ask. It was a moment of peace in a life that had known little of it. What the patrons didn't know, what most of Millfield didn't know, was that Leonard had spent much of his life serving his country. He was a Vietnam War veteran, though he rarely spoke of his service. It wasn't that he was ashamed. He simply didn't feel the need to recount stories that most people wouldn't understand. The medals tucked away in a shadow box at home, the haunting memories of friends lost, the grueling heat of the jungle, all of it felt like a distant yet ever-present echo. Leonard preferred to let the past rest, to find solace in the simplicity of quiet mornings and the company of strangers who didn't know his history. As Leonard folded the newspaper neatly and reached for his fork to take a bite of his scrambled eggs, the door to the diner swung open with a jarring clang. 2 uniformed police officers entered, their presence breaking the subdued atmosphere. The younger officer, Greg Thompson, had recently been assigned to Millfield. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the unearned swagger of someone who thought authority was a substitute for experience. His partner, Mark Davis, was leaner, wiry, and wore a smirk that seemed permanently etched on his face. Their voices, loud and self-assured, filled the diner as they exchanged jokes, their laughter cutting through the otherwise quiet murmur of conversation. The 2 were newcomers, and though Millfield was a place that welcomed most, their presence often felt like a disruption. They had made a habit of asserting their authority in ways that bordered on arrogance, and today would be no exception. As Thompson scanned the room, his gaze landed on Leonard, who sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the plate in front of him. Thompson's lips curled into a smirk, and he nudged Davis, gesturing toward Leonard with a tilt of his head. The 2 officers exchanged knowing looks. Thompson approached Leonard's booth, his boots clacking loudly against the tiled floor. He stopped at Leonard's table, crossing his arms as if to block the older man's view. Well, Thompson drawled, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby patrons. What do we have here? A little breakfast before a busy day, old-timer. Leonard looked up slowly, his calm gaze meeting Thompson's. He didn't flinch, didn't react to the mocking tone. Instead, he set his fork down deliberately, folding his hands on the table. "Something I can help you with, officer?" Leonard asked, his voice even and composed. Davis chuckled, leaning on the edge of the booth. "Maybe he's one of those drifters," he said, his words dripping with mockery. "You know, wandering through town looking for a free meal." Leonard's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't respond. He had faced worse than this in his lifetime. Thompson leaned in closer, his smirk widening. "Let's see some ID," he demanded, his tone no longer playful but insistent. Alice, standing behind the counter, froze in place, her hands gripping the coffee pot. She looked around nervously, but no one in the diner seemed willing to step in. This was Millfield, after all, a quiet town where people preferred to avoid confrontation, even if it meant watching someone else endure humiliation. Leonard met Thompson's gaze without blinking. "I'm just having breakfast," he said evenly, making no move to comply. Thompson's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "I said, let's see some ID," he repeated, his voice rising. The tension in the diner thickened. Some patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others pretended not to notice. Leonard reached slowly into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberate. The officers tensed, their hands instinctively hovering near their holstered guns. When Leonard's hand emerged, it held a worn leather wallet, the edges frayed from years of use. He placed it on the table and pushed it toward Thompson without a word. Thompson snatched the wallet up, flipping it open with a flourish. His smirk returned, briefly. But as he looked inside, his expression changed. His eyes widened, the color draining from his face. Inside the wallet was Leonard's military ID, along with a small, gleaming Medal of Honor, its surface polished and pristine despite its age. Thompson stared at it, the weight of what he was holding sinking in. This wasn't just an old man eating breakfast at a diner. This was a hero, a man who had faced horrors Thompson could only imagine, and survived with courage most could never muster. For a moment, Thompson was speechless. The smug confidence he had walked in with crumbled, replaced by an unmistakable shame. The silence in the diner was deafening as everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Leonard said nothing, his calm gaze never leaving Thompson's face. He didn't need to speak. The truth of who he was, the life he had lived, was laid bare in that moment, and it spoke louder than any words ever could. Unveiling the hero, Thompson stood frozen, his fingers trembling as he held Leonard's wallet. His wide-eyed stare was fixed on the military ID and the Medal of Honor, each a testament to a life lived with valor that he couldn't begin to comprehend. His partner, Davis, who had been smirking just moments before, leaned over curiously. But when his eyes caught sight of the medal, his smirk vanished. "What is it?" Davis asked, his voice quieter now, lacking the earlier edge. Thompson didn't reply. The diner, previously humming with quiet conversation, had fallen silent. All eyes were on the confrontation. Alice, still gripping the coffee pot behind the counter, exchanged uneasy glances with a few of the patrons. Finally, Leonard broke the silence. His voice was calm, steady, and carried with it the weight of decades. "Is there something you need, officer?" Thompson blinked, snapping out of his daze. He carefully closed the wallet, setting it back on the table as if it were made of fragile glass. His hand hovered there for a moment before he stepped back, his expression shifting from authority to discomfort. I didn't realize," Thompson stammered, his voice almost a whisper. "Didn't realize what?" Leonard asked, his tone even. He didn't reach for the wallet right away, leaving it sitting in the center of the table. Thompson looked away, the confidence that had fueled his earlier bravado completely drained. Davis, standing a step behind him, shifted uncomfortably, his face flushing with embarrassment. He glanced around the diner, noting the expressions on the patrons' faces, some watching with thinly veiled disgust, others with curiosity. Finally, Davis spoke, trying to regain some footing. "We didn't mean any disrespect, sir. We just—" He trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence. Leonard tilted his head slightly, studying the two young officers. For a long moment, he didn't speak, letting the weight of their discomfort settle over them. When he finally reached for his wallet, his movements were deliberate. He tucked it back into his jacket pocket, leaning back in his seat. "You thought I was just some old man wasting time at a booth," Leonard said, his words direct but not unkind. "That about right." Thompson opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Davis's face flushed deeper, and he found himself looking down at his boots. Leonard sighed, lifting his coffee cup to his lips and taking a measured sip. "You're not the first to make that assumption," he continued, "and I doubt you'll be the last. But let me give you some advice. Don't be so quick to judge someone. You wear that badge, and that means something. It means you serve the people in this town, all of them, even the ones you don't understand." Thompson nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "You're right, sir. I'm sorry." Leonard nodded once but didn't smile. "Sorry's a good start," he said. "But it's just a start. Respect is something you show every day, not just when you've been called out on it." The silence in the diner was almost oppressive as the two officers absorbed Leonard's words. For all their training, for all the authority their uniforms granted them, they were unprepared for the humility of this moment. They had thought themselves in control, yet here they stood, humbled by a man they had tried to demean. Alice finally broke the silence by stepping out from behind the counter. She approached Leonard's table with a fresh pot of coffee, her hands still shaking slightly. "More coffee, Mr. Harris?" she asked softly. Leonard looked up at her and gave a small nod. "Thank you, Alice." She poured the coffee carefully, her eyes flickering toward the officers for a moment before she returned to the counter. "Come on, Thompson," Davis muttered under his breath, nudging his partner's arm. Thompson hesitated, his gaze lingering on Leonard. "If there's anything we can do." Leonard shook his head, cutting him off. "Just do your job, son," he said firmly. "Do it with integrity. That's all I ask." Thompson nodded, swallowing hard before turning to leave. Davis followed, and the two officers exited the diner in silence, their once confident strides replaced by a humble shuffle. The door swung shut behind them, and the diner seemed to exhale collectively. Conversations resumed, though in hushed tones. Several patrons glanced toward Leonard with a new sense of respect, their expressions softened by the revelation of his quiet heroism. Alice returned to the counter, her hands no longer trembling, and gave Leonard a warm smile. "You okay, Mr. Harris?" she asked gently. Leonard nodded, though his face showed the faintest trace of weariness. "I'm fine, Alice," he said. "Thank you." As the morning wore on, the diner emptied out, and Leonard found himself alone in his booth. The sunlight streaming through the window had climbed higher, casting a golden glow over the table. He stared at his half-empty coffee cup, his thoughts drifting back through the years. For Leonard, moments like these were not new. He had lived long enough to see how people made assumptions based on appearances, but this morning had stirred something deeper in him, memories of times when he had been judged, underestimated, or dismissed simply because of the color of his skin or the weariness in his eyes. He thought about Vietnam, about the men he had served with, and the battles they had fought together. Those were the memories that stayed with him, vivid and unrelenting. Faces flashed through his mind, some smiling, some etched with fear, others forever frozen in his memory as they were in their final moments. Leonard closed his eyes and took a deep breath, grounding himself in the present. The past was always there, a shadow that never fully faded, but he had learned to live with it. Today had been a reminder of how far he had come, and how much further others still had to go. As he gathered his things to leave, Leonard felt a sense of quiet resolve. The confrontation at the diner had left a mark, not just on the officers, but on everyone who had witnessed it. Perhaps it would be enough to spark a change, however small. Outside, the air was crisp and clear, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. Leonard took a moment to adjust his jacket and glance down the street, where Thompson and Davis were sitting in their patrol car, their faces solemn. He met their gaze briefly before turning away and walking toward his truck, his step steady and unhurried. For Leonard, Life in Millfield would go on much as it always had, but today had been a reminder, both to himself and to the town, that even the quietest lives held stories worth telling. A reminder of sacrifice. The crisp air of Millfield bit at Leonard's face as he left Benny's diner, his steps deliberate as he walked toward his pickup truck, parked near the corner of the lot. The events inside the diner lingered in his mind, a bitter reminder of how quick some were to judge without understanding the stories others carried. Leonard paused as he reached his truck, his fingers brushing over the chipped paint of the driver's side door. He glanced back at the diner, its neon sign still flickering faintly. Through the large windows, he could see Alice moving between tables, clearing plates, and refilling coffee cups. A few patrons still sat in quiet conversation, but the energy of the room had shifted since his encounter with the officers. With a sigh, Leonard climbed into the cab of his truck. The vehicle was old but reliable, much like him. He turned the key, and the engine roared to life with a comforting rumble. As he drove through the town's quiet streets, the memories that had surfaced earlier refused to fade. The familiar landmarks of Millfield passed by, its small library, the hardware store, the corner park where kids played in the afternoons. But Leonard's mind was miles away, caught in the dense, humid jungles of Vietnam. It wasn't something he dwelled on often. He'd spent years burying those memories, focusing on the present rather than the past. But encounters like the one at the diner had a way of cracking open the walls he'd built, letting the memories flood back with vivid clarity. Leonard found himself driving toward a place he hadn't visited in a while. Millfield's Veterans Memorial Park. Situated on the edge of town, the park was small but solemn, a quiet space dedicated to honoring the men and women who had served in wars past. The centerpiece of the park was a stone monument etched with the names of local veterans. Leonard's name was there, along with those of friends and comrades who had fought beside him. He parked his truck near the entrance and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel path. The air was cooler here, shaded by tall oaks that lined the park. The sound of rustling leaves filled the silence as Leonard walked slowly toward the monument. When he reached it, he stood for a long moment, his eyes scanning the names engraved in the stone. His fingers traced over the letters of familiar names: Jenkins, Martinez, and Andrews. Each name brought with it a flood of memories, faces, voices, laughter, and the shared camaraderie that had been their lifeline in the chaos of war. Leonard's thoughts drifted to Jenkins, the youngest member of his squad. Barely 18, Jenkins had been full of energy and optimism, always ready with a joke to lift their spirits. Leonard had taken the boy under his wing, feeling a sense of responsibility for him. But in the brutal reality of war, responsibility wasn't always enough. It had been during the siege of Khe Sanh, a battle etched into Leonard's memory with painful clarity. Their position had been overrun, and chaos erupted around them. Jenkins had been hit, a single bullet that ended a life brimming with potential. Leonard had been right beside him, helpless to save the young man who had trusted him with everything. The guilt of that moment had followed Leonard home. He had replayed it countless times in his mind, wondering what he could have done differently, how he could have prevented it. But there were no answers, only the lingering weight of loss. Standing before the monument, Leonard closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, Jenkins," he whispered, the words barely audible. "I'm doing my best to honor you, to honor all of you." The rustling of leaves seemed to respond, a gentle reassurance from the world around him. Leonard didn't know if Jenkins or the others could hear him, but he spoke to them often. Quiet conversations in moments like this, when the memories felt too heavy to carry alone. As he stood in silence, he heard the crunch of gravel behind him. Turning, he saw Eddie Marshall approaching. The young man was carrying a small notebook and pen, his expression earnest and respectful. "Mr. Harris," Eddie called softly, his voice tentative. Leonard nodded in acknowledgement. "Morning, Eddie." Eddie stopped a few feet away, clutching his notebook nervously. I heard about what happened at the diner," he began, his cheeks flushing slightly. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry you had to go through that. You deserve better." Leonard gave a faint smile, his eyes softening. "Thank you, Eddie. That means a lot." Eddie hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to share your story for the Veterans Project we're working on at the community center. I think it's important for people to know what you and others like you have been through." Leonard considered the request, his gaze drifting back to the monument. Sharing his story wasn't something he had done often. It wasn't that he didn't want to. It was just hard to put into words the things he had seen and experienced. But Eddie's sincerity touched him. After a long pause, Leonard nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll tell you a story, but just one." Eddie's face lit up with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. I'll make sure it's written exactly how you tell it." The two of them sat on a nearby bench, the monument looming in the background. Leonard began to speak, his voice steady but tinged with emotion as he recounted the story of Quezon. He told Eddie about the camaraderie of his squad, the relentless siege, and the sacrifices made by men like Jenkins. Eddie listened intently, scribbling notes in his notebook. He didn't interrupt, letting Leonard's words flow freely. When Leonard finished, there was a long silence between them. "Thank you for sharing that," Eddie said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll make sure people know. I'll make sure they remember." Leonard nodded, feeling a sense of relief he hadn't expected. It wasn't easy to share his story, but knowing that Eddie would carry it forward made the burden feel a little lighter. As Eddie stood to leave, he turned back to Leonard. "You're a hero, Mr. Harris," he said sincerely. Leonard shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "No, Eddie, I'm just a man who did his duty. The real heroes are the ones whose names are on that stone." Eddie nodded solemnly before walking away, leaving Leonard alone with his thoughts once more. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the park. Leonard stood and placed a hand on the monument, his fingers lingering on Jenkins's name. "Rest easy, boys," he murmured. "You're not forgotten." As he walked back to his truck, Leonard felt a renewed sense of purpose. The past was always with him, but so was the responsibility to ensure that the sacrifices of his comrades were remembered. Today, he had taken another step toward fulfilling that responsibility. Bridges across generations. The following morning, Leonard Harris woke to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. The golden sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting soft patterns on the wooden floor of his modest home. His house was simple, a single-story building with a front porch that creaked when stepped on, and a backyard where he grew a small vegetable garden. It was a place of solitude, a sanctuary from the world and its noise. Leonard rose slowly, his joints stiff with age. He went through his usual routine, brushing his teeth, shaving carefully to maintain the sharp look he'd carried since his service days, and dressing in a clean flannel shirt and jeans. As he prepared breakfast, his thoughts returned to the conversation he'd had with Eddie at the Veterans Memorial the previous day. It wasn't often that Leonard let people into his world. He'd spent decades keeping his story to himself, not out of shame but out of a belief that no one truly wanted to know. Yet Eddie had listened. The young man's earnestness and respect had stirred something in Leonard, a quiet realization that perhaps his story wasn't just his own. After breakfast, Leonard stepped out onto his porch, his boots thudding against the weathered wood. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine from the trees that lined the edge of his property. He stood there for a moment, gazing out at the road that stretched beyond his house, and decided to take a walk. The dirt path leading away from his home wound through the outskirts of Millfield, passing fields, streams, and the occasional farmhouse. Leonard had walked this path countless times, finding peace in the rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath his boots and the quiet beauty of the countryside. As he rounded a bend in the path, he heard a voice calling out to him. "Mr. Harris, wait up." He turned to see Eddie jogging toward him, his notebook tucked under one arm. The young man was slightly out of breath, but smiling widely. "Morning, Eddie," Leonard greeted, his voice calm and steady. "Good morning, sir," Eddie replied, slowing to a stop beside him. "I hope I'm not interrupting your walk." Leonard shook his head. "Not at all. What brings you out this way?" Eddie held up his notebook. "I've been writing down what you told me yesterday. And I've been thinking, we could use someone like you to talk to the high school students. The principal's organizing an event for Veterans Day, and I think it would mean a lot to them to hear your story." Leonard frowned slightly, his gaze drifting to the horizon. Public speaking wasn't something he relished. He preferred the quiet, the anonymity of his day-to-day life. Yet Eddie's enthusiasm and determination were hard to ignore. "Why do you think they'd want to hear from me?" Leonard asked after a pause. "Because your story matters," Eddie said simply. "You've lived through things most of us can't even imagine. And honestly, I think a lot of people my age don't really understand what it means to serve, to sacrifice. You can help them see that." Leonard studied Eddie's face, noting the sincerity in his eyes. The young man reminded him of Jenkins in some ways, eager, full of potential, and driven by a sense of purpose. "I'll think about it," Leonard said finally. Eddie nodded, undeterred. "Fair enough. Just let me know. And if you want, I can help you prepare. I've been talking to some of the other veterans around town for the project. They've got amazing stories too, but yours stands out." Leonard raised an eyebrow. "You're working hard on this, aren't you?" Eddie grinned. "I am. It's important to me. My grandpa was a vet, and I never got to hear much about his service before he passed. This project feels like a way to honor him, and everyone else who served." Leonard nodded slowly. "Your grandpa would be proud of you." Eddie's smile widened. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." The two continued walking, their conversation shifting to lighter topics. Eddie asked Leonard about his garden, his favorite places in Millfield, and even what kind of music he liked. Leonard found himself chuckling at the young man's curiosity, answering each question with a patience he didn't often extend to others. By the time they reached the edge of town, Leonard felt a rare sense of connection. Eddie's genuine respect and interest had broken through the walls Leonard had spent years building, reminding him that there was value in sharing his life, even the parts that were painful. Later that week, the following days passed uneventfully. Leonard returned to his usual routine, mornings at Benny's diner, afternoons tending to his garden or reading in his favorite chair by the window. Yet the thought of speaking at the high school lingered in his mind. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, Leonard finally made up his mind. He reached for the rotary phone on the small table beside him and dialed the number Eddie had left. The young man answered on the second ring, his voice filled with excitement. "Hello. It's Leonard," he said simply. "I'll do it." Eddie let out a whoop of joy. "That's great, Mr. Harris. Thank you. I'll let the principal know right away." Leonard chuckled softly. "Don't thank me yet. I haven't even spoken a word." "You'll do great," Eddie assured him. "I'll swing by tomorrow to help you get ready." Preparing to speak. The next morning, Eddie arrived at Leonard's house armed with notes, a laptop, and a thermos of coffee. The two of them sat at Leonard's kitchen table, the light streaming through the window as they worked together to outline what Leonard might say. Eddie was patient and encouraging, helping Leonard shape his experiences into a story that would resonate with the students. They decided to focus on the themes of courage, sacrifice, and resilience, values that transcended time and generations. As they worked, Leonard found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. He shared stories he hadn't told in years, details he had buried deep. Eddie listened intently, his pen flying across the pages of his notebook as he captured every word. By the time they finished, Leonard felt a mixture of apprehension and determination. Speaking about his past wasn't easy, but he trusted Eddie's instincts. If sharing his story could help even one young person understand the cost of freedom and the strength required to carry it. Then it would be worth it. The day of the event. On Veterans Day, Leonard arrived at the high school auditorium wearing his best blazer and tie. His Medal of Honor was pinned to his lapel, polished to a gleaming shine. The sight of it always stirred conflicting emotions in him, pride for what it represented, but also sorrow for the sacrifices it symbolized. The auditorium was packed with students, teachers, and parents. The principal introduced Leonard with a brief speech, recounting his years of service and his decorations. When Leonard stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. He took a moment to scan the crowd, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. The sea of young faces reminded him of his own squad, so full of life, with futures stretching out before them. "Good morning," Leonard began, his voice steady but quiet. "I don't stand here today because I wanted recognition. I'm here because people like Eddie reminded me that stories like mine shouldn't be forgotten. Not because I'm special, but because of the men I served with, the ones who didn't come home." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I was your age when I first set foot in Vietnam," he continued. "I thought I knew what bravery was, but I learned quickly that bravery isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you're scared out of your mind." For the next half hour, Leonard shared the story of his squad, the Battle of Khe Sanh, and the sacrifices made by men like Jenkins. He spoke about the bonds of brotherhood, the pain of loss, and the resilience it took to move forward. When he finished, the auditorium erupted into applause. Leonard stood there, his eyes scanning the crowd, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. His story had been heard, and it would not be forgotten. A town's awakening. The applause thundered through the high school auditorium, rising to the rafters and enveloping Leonard in a sound he hadn't expected. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was genuine, heartfelt, and sustained. The students rose from their seats, their applause growing louder. Some cheered softly, while others wiped their eyes, clearly moved by the weight of Leonard's story. Standing at the podium, Leonard felt a lump rise in his throat. He had spent decades living quietly, deliberately avoiding attention. And yet, in this moment, he realized that sharing his story had given voice not only to his experiences, but also to the memories of the men who had stood beside him, those who hadn't come home. Principal Howard approached the stage, her face glowing with admiration. She extended a hand to Leonard, and he shook it firmly as she leaned into the microphone. "Thank you, Mr. Harris, for your service and for sharing your story with us today. Your courage and sacrifices are an inspiration to us all." The applause surged again as Leonard gave a polite nod and stepped back from the podium. He didn't need to say more. The students' reactions told him everything he needed to know. Eddie Marshall was waiting for him at the edge of the stage, grinning from ear to ear. "Mr. Harris, that was incredible," he said, practically bouncing with excitement. "You had everyone on the edge of their seats." Leonard gave him a small smile. "I wasn't sure I'd make it through," he admitted, "but I'm glad I did." Eddie nodded enthusiastically. "You did more than make it through. You made an impact. People are going to remember this for a long time." As the crowd began to disperse, students and parents approached Leonard to thank him personally. Some shared their own connections to the military, grandparents, uncles, and cousins who had served. Others simply expressed their gratitude, their voices tinged with newfound respect. A young girl, no older than 16, stepped forward timidly. Her dark hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and she clutched a small notebook to her chest. "Mr. Harris," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I just wanted to say thank you. My grandpa served in Vietnam too, but he never talked about it. Listening to you, I feel like I understand him a little better now." Leonard looked into her earnest eyes and nodded. "That's why I did this," he said gently, "to help people understand. Your grandpa, he's a hero too, even if he didn't say it out loud." The girl smiled, tears glistening in her eyes, and stepped back into the crowd. a ripple in the town. The impact of Leonard's speech didn't fade after that day. Word spread quickly throughout Millfield, reaching people who hadn't attended the event. At Benny's diner the following morning, Leonard was greeted with more than the usual nods and polite greetings. "Good morning, Mr. Harris," Alice said warmly as she poured his coffee. Her smile was brighter than usual, and there was a distinct glimmer of pride in her eyes. "You've been the talk of the town. I've had at least 10 people come in here and tell me how much your speech meant to them." Leonard shifted in his seat, feeling slightly uncomfortable with the attention. "I just told the truth," he said modestly. "Well, sometimes people need to hear the truth," Alice replied. She hesitated for a moment before leaning in closer. "You know, my dad served in Korea. He never talked about it either. After hearing about your speech, I found myself wishing I'd asked him more questions while I had the chance." Leonard looked up at her, his expression softening. "It's not easy to talk about," he said. "But you remembering him, that matters." Alice nodded, her smile fading slightly as she stepped away to tend to another customer. As Leonard sipped his coffee, he noticed the way people glanced at him differently now. Their looks were no longer fleeting or indifferent. Instead, they carried a sense of acknowledgement and respect. A few patrons even approached his table to thank him, their words heartfelt and genuine. Among them was Officer Greg Thompson, who had been conspicuously absent from the diner since their first encounter. Today, however, he walked in with a more subdued demeanor, his head held lower than usual. When he spotted Leonard, he hesitated for a moment before making his way over. "Mr. Harris," Thompson said, his voice quieter than Leonard had ever heard it, "I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened the other day, and for not recognizing who you are. I heard about your speech at the school. I'm sorry I wasn't there to hear it myself, but I'm glad you shared your story." Leonard studied Thompson for a moment, his sharp eyes searching for sincerity. He saw it, alongside a hint of shame and a desire to make amends. "Apology accepted," Leonard said finally. "But like I told you before, respect isn't about what you say. It's about what you do. Make sure you carry that with you." Thompson nodded earnestly. "I will, sir. Thank you." As Thompson walked away, Leonard felt a small measure of satisfaction. The young officer had learned something, and perhaps that was the first step toward change. A community united. Later that week, Eddie stopped by Leonard's house with an exciting update. The community center was planning a special event to honor local veterans, inspired by Leonard's speech at the school. They wanted Leonard to be the guest of honor, and to help unveil a new display dedicated to Millfield's servicemen and women. Leonard hesitated at first, reluctant to take center stage again. But Eddie's enthusiasm was contagious, and the idea of a permanent tribute to the town's veterans resonated with him. On the day of the event, the community center was packed. The walls were adorned with photographs, letters, and memorabilia from veterans of every era. The centerpiece of the display was a plaque featuring the names of local veterans, including Leonard's. When Leonard stepped up to speak, the room fell silent. He looked out at the crowd, his heart heavy with memories of those who hadn't made it home. "This isn't just about me," he began, his voice steady. "It's about every man and woman who put on the uniform and served this country. It's about sacrifice, about courage, and about the bonds we form in the face of adversity. The names on this plaque, some of them were my friends, some of them didn't come home. And it's up to us to remember them, to honor their legacy, and to carry forward the lessons they taught us." The crowd erupted into applause as Leonard stepped back. He felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known in years, a sense that his story and the stories of his comrades would live on. The beginning of change. In the weeks that followed, Leonard noticed a subtle but meaningful shift in the town. People seemed to approach one another with more kindness, more understanding. Conversations about the town's veterans grew more frequent, and younger generations began to show a renewed interest in their family histories. Leonard's life didn't change drastically. He still spent his mornings at Benny's, his afternoons in the garden, and his evenings on the porch. But he carried himself with a quiet pride, knowing that his story had made a difference. And as the days turned to weeks, and the weeks to months, Leonard Harris remained what he had always been, a man of quiet strength, resilience, and unwavering dignity. The threads of memory. Winter arrived in Millfield with a soft touch, draping the small town in a thin veil of frost that sparkled in the morning sunlight. Leonard Harris sat in his favorite chair by the window, sipping a steaming cup of coffee as he watched the world outside transform into a delicate canvas of white. His mornings had settled back into their familiar rhythm, but the undercurrent of change in the town was impossible to ignore. He had noticed it in small ways, in the warmth of the greetings he received at Benny's diner, in the respectful nods from the younger townsfolk, and in the quiet conversations he overheard at the community center. His speech at the high school and the event at the Veterans Display had ignited something, a curiosity, a hunger to understand and honor the lives of those who had served. For Leonard, the change was a quiet vindication. His story, once carried silently, had found its way into the hearts of his neighbors. But with that recognition came a bittersweet weight. The faces of those he had served with, those who hadn't made it back, lingered in his thoughts more often now. They were not haunting him, but they were present, as if reminding him of the responsibility he carried to keep their memories alive. That morning, as Leonard finished his coffee, a knock at the door broke the quiet. Setting his mug down, he rose slowly and walked to the door, opening it to find Eddie Marshall standing on his porch. The young man's cheeks were pink from the cold, and his breath formed small clouds in the crisp air. "Morning, Mr. Harris," Eddie said, grinning as he held up a folder. "Morning, Eddie," Leonard replied with a small smile. "What brings you out here in this weather?" Eddie stepped inside, stamping the snow off his boots. "I've been working on something," he said, holding up the folder. "It's for the Veterans Project. I thought you might want to see it." Leonard gestured for him to sit at the kitchen table while he grabbed a second cup of coffee. Eddie spread out the contents of the folder, pages of typed text, photographs, and handwritten notes. "I've been talking to more veterans in town," Eddie explained, his enthusiasm bubbling over. "And I've been digging through archives and family records. I'm putting together a book, a collection of stories about Millfield's veterans. I want to make sure their sacrifices are remembered." Leonard sat down, his gaze sweeping over the pages. The photographs caught his eye first, faded black and white images of young men in uniform, some smiling broadly, others standing solemnly. He recognized a few of the faces, though he hadn't seen them in decades. "You've done a lot of work," Leonard said, his voice tinged with admiration. Eddie beamed. "It's been worth it. I've learned so much, not just about the wars, but about the people. Like Mr. Grayson, he served in Korea. Did you know he saved 2 of his buddies during a snowstorm by carrying them on his back for miles? And Mrs. Carter? She was a nurse in World War II, treating soldiers on the front lines. It's incredible what they went through." Leonard nodded, his mind drifting to his own memories. "They didn't talk about it much, did they?" "No, they didn't," Eddie agreed. "But when I told them about you, about what you shared, they opened up a little. It's like you gave them permission to let their stories out." Leonard looked at Eddie, his expression softening. "You're doing something important, Eddie. These stories, they matter. They deserve to be told." Eddie's grin widened. "That's why I wanted to include you. I wrote down everything you shared about Kisan, but I wanted to make sure it's accurate. And if there's anything else you'd like to add, I'd be honored to include it." Leonard leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. "All right. I'll tell you something I haven't shared yet. A new story." Eddie grabbed his notebook and pen, ready to capture every word. Leonard took a deep breath, his hands clasped on the table in front of him. "It was the middle of the siege," he began, his voice steady but soft. "We were running low on supplies, Morale was shot, and every night felt like it could be our last. The enemy was relentless. Artillery, mortar fire, snipers. They didn't let up, not even for a minute. Eddie's pen moved quickly across the page, his eyes never leaving Leonard's face. There was a young soldier in my squad, Private William Billy Tucker. He was barely 19, fresh-faced, eager to prove himself, but scared. You could see it in his eyes, even when he tried to hide it. The young man nodded, his expression thoughtful. As the crowd dispersed, Eddie approached Leonard with a printed draft of the book. "It's almost done," he said, beaming. "And I couldn't have done it without you." Leonard took the draft, his hands brushing over the cover. It was a simple design, but the title struck him deeply. "The Stories We Carry, Millfield's Veterans Remembered." "It's a good title," Leonard said quietly. "It's your title," Eddie replied. "You said it during your speech, and it stuck with me." Leonard looked at the young man, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Eddie, for everything." Eddie shook his head. "No, Mr. Harris, thank you." As Leonard walked home that evening, the snow crunching beneath his boots, he felt a rare sense of fulfillment. His story, and the stories of those who had stood beside him, were no longer just memories. They were part of something larger, something lasting. And for the first time in years, Leonard Harris felt truly at peace, honoring the unsung. The crisp morning air carried a promise of change as Leonard Harris walked to the Millfield Community Center. The building stood at the heart of the town, bustling with activity and anticipation. Today wasn't just any day. It was the official unveiling of Eddie Marshall's book, The Stories We Carry, Millfield's Veterans Remembered, an event that had grown beyond anything either Leonard or Eddie had expected. The project had started with quiet conversations and old photographs, but it had evolved into something much greater. The entire town had rallied behind Eddie's work, and the young man's dedication had turned a simple idea into a significant event. Veterans from neighboring towns, local officials, families, and even a few reporters had gathered to honor the stories of Millfield's heroes. Leonard approached the building, adjusting the collar of his blazer. His Medal of Honor gleamed on his lapel, polished to perfection. Though he still felt uneasy about being the center of attention, he understood that this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever served, especially those who hadn't made it home. As he entered the center, he was greeted with warm smiles and firm handshakes. Eddie spotted him from across the room and rushed over, holding a hardcover copy of the book. "Mr. Harris, you're here," Eddie said, his voice brimming with excitement. He handed Leonard the book, its weight substantial in his hands. Leonard ran his fingers over the embossed title and the photograph on the cover, a black and white image of the Veterans Memorial Plaque. Below the title was a subtitle that read, "A Tribute to Courage, Sacrifice, and Resilience." "You've done something incredible, Eddie," Leonard said, his voice low but filled with pride. Eddie grinned. "I couldn't have done it without you. Your story, your bravery, it's the heart of this book." Leonard shook his head. "The heart of this book is all of us, Eddie. The ones who came back, and the ones who didn't." Eddie nodded solemnly. "You're right, and that's why we're here, to make sure none of them are forgotten." The ceremony. The event began in the center's main hall, where chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a small stage. The room was decorated with American flags and banners that read, "Honoring Millfield's Heroes." The centerpiece of the stage was a podium, flanked by large easels displaying photographs of veterans whose stories were included in the book. Leonard took a seat in the front row alongside other veterans, some of whom he hadn't seen in years. There was Harold Grayson, a Korean War veteran whose quiet demeanor belied his extraordinary bravery during a deadly blizzard, and Eleanor Carter, the nurse whose tireless work in field hospitals during World War I had saved countless lives. Principal Howard stepped up to the podium, her voice clear and steady as she addressed the crowd. "Today, we gather not just to celebrate a book, but to honor the lives and stories that make up our community's history. Each story in the stories we carry is a thread in the fabric of who we are, a reminder of the courage and resilience that define us. She gestured toward Eddie, who rose to thunderous applause. The young man looked slightly overwhelmed but beamed as he made his way to the stage. "Thank you," Eddie began, his voice trembling slightly. "This project started as a way for me to understand my grandpa's service, but along the way, I realized it was about so much more. It's about all of you, the veterans who gave so much, the families who supported them, and the community that remembers them." Eddie paused, looking directly at Leonard. "And it's about people like Mr. Harris, who remind us that even the quietest among us can carry the most extraordinary stories." The audience erupted in applause, and Leonard felt his chest tighten with emotion. He wasn't used to such public acknowledgement, but there was a warmth in the room that made him feel deeply connected to everyone around him. A quiet moment. After the ceremony, Leonard found himself standing near one of the displays, studying a photograph of his old squad. The black and white image showed a group of young men, their faces etched with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. Leonard stood in the center, his arm slung over the shoulders of Jenkins, the youngest among them. "Mr. Harris." He turned to see a young woman standing nearby. She looked to be in her early 20s, her auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She held a notebook in one hand and a pen in the other, her expression a mixture of nervousness and admiration. "Yes," Leonard replied. "My name's Clara," she said, her voice soft. "I'm a journalism student. I've been following Eddie's project, and I was wondering if you'd mind answering a few questions." Leonard hesitated, then nodded. "Go ahead." Clara opened her notebook, her hands trembling slightly. "First, I just want to thank you for your service and for sharing your story. I think it's incredibly important for people my age to understand what you and others went through." Leonard gave her a small smile. "Thank you. What would you like to know?" Clara glanced at her notes. "In your speech, you talked about resilience. Can you tell me more about what that means to you?" Leonard leaned against the display, folding his arms across his chest. "Resilience is about more than just surviving," he said after a moment. "It's about finding a way to move forward, even when you've lost so much. It's about honoring the sacrifices of those who didn't make it by living a life that's worth their sacrifice." Clara nodded, scribbling furiously in her notebook. "And what do you hope people take away from your story?" Leonard's gaze drifted back to the photograph. "I hope they understand that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about standing up in the face of fear, doing what needs to be done, and looking out for the people around you. And I hope they realize that everyone carries a story, whether they wear a uniform or not. It's our job to listen." Clara smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. That's beautiful." As she walked away, Leonard turned back to the photograph, his thoughts drifting to the men in his squad. "You're not forgotten," he murmured. "Not by me, and not by them." A town transformed. In the weeks following the book launch, Millfield seemed to shift in small but significant ways. The stories in the stories we carry sparked conversations among families, friends, and neighbors. People who had once overlooked the town's veterans began to see them with fresh eyes, recognizing the depth of their sacrifices and the strength of their character. At the community center, a permanent display was erected, featuring the photographs and stories from the book. It became a place where people could reflect, learn, and pay their respects. Leonard found himself visiting the display often, sometimes with Eddie, sometimes alone. Each visit felt like a quiet pilgrimage, a way to honor not only his own past, but the shared history of everyone who had served. One day, as Leonard stood before the display, a young boy approached him, clutching the copy of the book. "Mr. Harris," the boy asked shyly. Leonard knelt down to meet his gaze. "Yes. Thank you for being brave," the boy said, holding out the book for Leonard to sign. Leonard felt a lump rise in his throat as he took the book and signed his name with a steady hand. "Thank you for listening," he said. As the boy ran back to his parents, Leonard stood and gazed at the display, his heart full. He had spent much of his life carrying his story alone, but now it belonged to the town, to the people who cared enough to remember. For the first time in years, Leonard Harris felt truly seen. Passing the torch. Spring returned to Millfield in a burst of color and life. The snow melted away, revealing budding flowers and green shoots in every garden. Leonard Harris sat on his front porch, the warm sun on his face as he sipped his morning coffee. The town felt different these days, brighter, more connected. The transformation wasn't grand or sudden, but it was unmistakable. People looked each other in the eye more often. They exchanged stories, lingered longer in conversations, and expressed gratitude in ways they hadn't before. Leonard's life had changed too. He still valued his solitude, but he found himself more involved in the community, whether it was helping Eddie with follow-up interviews for the stories we carry, speaking to local school children, or lending his quiet strength to the town's Veterans Memorial. Leonard had become a figure of respect and admiration. One morning, Leonard received a phone call from Principal Howard. She wanted him to participate in a new initiative, a mentorship program pairing veterans with students. The goal was to bridge the gap between generations, allowing students to learn directly from the experiences of those who had served. Leonard hesitated, unsure if he was the right person for the job. But the principal's words lingered. "You have a way of making people listen, Mr. Harris. These kids need someone like you." After some thought, Leonard agreed. The first meeting. A week later, Leonard arrived at Millfield High School for the program's inaugural meeting. The library had been transformed into a welcoming space, with round tables arranged in clusters and refreshments laid out on a side table. Students mingled nervously, some sneaking glances at the veterans who had volunteered. Leonard scanned the room, recognizing a few familiar faces, Harold Grayson and Eleanor Carter among them. He nodded at them in greeting before taking his place at a table marked with his name. A young boy approached hesitantly. He was tall for his age, with sandy hair that fell into his eyes and a backpack slung over one shoulder. "Hi, Mr. Harris," the boy said, his voice quiet. "I'm Sam." Leonard extended a hand. "Nice to meet you, Sam. Have a seat." Sam sat down, fidgeting with the straps of his backpack. "They said we're supposed to ask you about your experiences," he said, glancing at a list of questions on a crumpled piece of paper. "But I don't want to say anything stupid." Leonard chuckled softly. "There's no such thing as a stupid question, Sam. Just ask what you want to know." Sam looked relieved and folded the paper, slipping it into his pocket. "Okay. Well, what was it like? Being in a war, I mean." Leonard leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "It was hard," he said simply. "It was terrifying at times, but it was also important. It taught me things I never would have learned otherwise. About myself, about other people, about what it means to keep going even when you're scared." Sam nodded slowly, his eyes wide. "Were you ever scared?" "All the time," Leonard admitted. "Anyone who says they weren't scared is lying. But courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what you have to do, even when you're afraid." The boy seemed to absorb Leonard's words, his fidgeting subsiding. "My dad always says I need to be braver," he said after a pause. "Like when I mess up in baseball or something. But I guess it's not the same kind of brave you're talking about." Leonard smiled faintly. "Bravery takes many forms, Sam. Standing up after a mistake, that's a kind of bravery too. And the more you practice it, the stronger it gets." Their conversation continued, touching on topics both light and serious. Sam asked about Leonard's favorite foods, his hobbies, and the friendships he'd formed during the war. Leonard answered each question with patience, weaving lessons into his stories. By the end of the session, Sam's initial shyness had faded. He stood a little taller, his voice more confident as he thanked Leonard and promised to come back for the next meeting. A growing legacy, The mentorship program became a cornerstone of Leonard's weeks. Each session brought new students with new questions, and Leonard found himself surprised by how much he enjoyed the interactions. He saw pieces of his younger self in their uncertainty, their curiosity, and their eagerness to understand the world. One afternoon, after a particularly engaging session, Eddie stopped by Leonard's house with a surprise. He carried a large envelope, which he handed to Leonard with a sheepish grin. "What's this?" Leonard asked, peering inside. "It's from the state," Eddie said. "Your story caught someone's attention. They're inviting you to speak at the Capitol for a Veterans Day ceremony. They want to honor you and the book." Leonard pulled out the letter, his brow furrowing as he read it. The invitation was formal and heartfelt, praising his contributions both as a soldier and as a storyteller. "I don't know, Eddie," Leonard said, setting the letter on the table. "I'm not one for big ceremonies." Eddie leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Mr. Harris, this isn't just about you. It's about everyone whose story you've helped bring to light. You've inspired so many people, me included. If you go, you'll inspire even more." Leonard looked at Eddie, seeing the determination in his eyes. He thought of the men he'd served with, the memories he carried, and the responsibility he felt to honor them. "All right," he said finally. "I'll do it." The Capitol speech. On Veterans Day, Leonard stood at the podium in the state capitol, the grand hall filled with rows of dignitaries, veterans, and their families. Cameras flashed as he approached, but Leonard focused on the crowd, grounding himself in the faces before him. He began simply, "My name is Leonard Harris. I'm a veteran of the Vietnam War, but more importantly, I'm a man who has lived to tell the stories of those who didn't make it home." He spoke about Kisan, about Jenkins, and about the bonds forged in the crucible of war. He spoke about resilience, courage, and the importance of remembering. But he also spoke about hope. "What I've learned," he said, his voice steady, "is that the human spirit is stronger than any hardship. And when we share our stories, when we truly listen to one another, we build bridges that can withstand anything." When he finished, the hall erupted in applause. Leonard stood there, humbled by the reaction, but filled with a deep sense of purpose. The quiet hero. As the years went by, Leonard's life in Millfield remained steady. The book continued to inspire new generations, and the mentorship program grew into a cherished tradition. Leonard became a beloved figure in the town, not because of the honors he received, but because of the quiet wisdom and kindness he shared. On a sunny spring morning, Leonard sat on his porch, watching as Eddie approached with a new group of students. The young faces looked up at him with curiosity and respect, and Leonard felt a familiar warmth in his chest. "Ready for another session, Mr. Harris?" Eddie called. Leonard smiled. "Always." And as he rose to greet them, Leonard Harris knew that his legacy was secure, not in medals or accolades, but in the lives he had touched and the stories he had passed on. "The stories we carry," he thought, "are the ones that keep us connected. And as long as they're remembered, we'll never truly be alone."